The rain poured heavily over the streets of London, turning the pavements into liquid mirrors reflecting the city's lights. In a forgotten corner of a bustling bridge, Emily sat wrapped in a faded blanket, clutching her small sketchbook with trembling hands. On the other side of the bridge, Ethan waited in his luxury car for the traffic light to change, his gaze distracted by the scene before him. There was something in her expression, a mixture of sorrow and determination, that struck him like lightning. He'd never believed in destiny, but in that moment, he felt something profound was about to change his life forever. Ethan Hayes was the epitome of modern success. At 35, he turned a modest tech startup into a billion-pound empire. To those who knew him on the surface, Ethan was a man who had it all: a luxurious penthouse in Knightsbridge, high-performance cars, and an endless stream of invitations to exclusive social events. But behind the rehearsed smile and impeccable posture lay an overwhelming loneliness. His meticulously planned routine left little room for anything beyond contracts, meetings, and numbers. He often wondered if there was more to life than this, but he'd quickly pushed the thought aside. After all, success was everything, wasn't it? Across the city, living in a world that felt like another universe, was Emily Turner. 3 years ago, a whirlwind of events had torn her from a stable life and cast her onto the streets of London. The loss of her parents in a car accident, combined with insurmountable debt, shattered everything she knew. An artist by nature, Emily carried only a sketchbook and the memory of a home that no longer existed. Despite it all, she refused to give up on herself. Every sketch in her book was an attempt to capture a fragment of beauty amidst the chaos surrounding her. Fate, unpredictable and whimsical, began weaving threads that would connect these two vastly different worlds. One particularly exhausting evening, Ethan found himself aimlessly driving through the city, a habitual escape. The hum of tires on the road seemed to ease the weight of his responsibilities. Meanwhile, under the bridge, Emily battled the cold and the creeping despair. The constant patter of rain and the hurried footsteps of passers-by served as the soundtrack of her existence. By some curious twist, they both began frequenting the same cafe in the weeks that followed, albeit for different reasons. Ethan had stumbled upon the cozy spot almost by accident, drawn to the anonymity it provided. Emily, on the other hand, had struck a deal with the owner. In exchange for designing small posters to advertise the cafe, she'd receive a hot meal each day. Although they never exchanged words, Ethan often found his gaze drawn to Emily's artwork displayed on the walls. Her vibrant reimaginings of London streets and landmarks stirred emotions he hadn't felt in years. These silent interactions sowed the seeds of a mutual recognition that, though subtle, steadily grew. Ethan, unknowingly, began questioning the emptiness of his meticulously ordered life. Emily, in turn, found a glimmer of hope in Ethan's occasional glances, proof that kindness still existed in the world. Ethan spent his days buried in figures, contracts, and presentations. But on Friday nights, he had a habit of driving aimlessly, seeking solace away from the oppressive luxury of his penthouse. During these nocturnal escapes, he often ventured into London's humbler neighborhoods, places that reminded him of his childhood before wealth had rendered his life strangely hollow. On the other side of the city, Emily remained resilient in her routine. She'd rise early to secure a spot in the queue at a community center, where volunteers handed out hot soup and blankets. Later, she'd head to a nearby park, spending hours sketching. Her art wasn't just an expression, it was an emotional lifeline. Every stroke was a reminder that, despite everything, she was still here. On one of those mornings, Emily had a brief yet meaningful conversation with Arthur, a soft-spoken retiree who volunteered at the community center. He spent his days helping people like Emily and often offered quiet words of encouragement. "You've got an incredible talent," he said, holding one of her sketches with careful hands. "Have you ever thought about sharing this with the world?" Emily gave a faint smile, unable to imagine anyone truly caring about her work. Yet, Arthur's words lingered, echoing in her mind as she sat in the park later that day, watching people hurry past. Across the city, Ethan's world was spinning faster than ever. Pressure in the office was mounting as he approached a pivotal deal, one that would cement his company's position as a market leader. Yet, the usual thrill was absent. Sitting in a boardroom surrounded by consultants and lawyers, Ethan felt the weight of a nagging unease he couldn't quite pinpoint. Naturally, he said nothing to anyone. Vulnerability had no place in the carefully crafted image he projected. That week, on an especially rainy evening, Ethan and Emily's paths were set to cross for the first time. Exhausted from a suffocating day of negotiations, Ethan chose to take the longer route home, driving through quieter streets. Meanwhile, Emily, sheltering under her usual bridge, clutched her sketchbook tightly as the rain turned the pavements into shimmering canvases. The rain fell on London as if it would never stop, each drop intensifying the gleam of city lights reflected on the wet streets. Ethan drove aimlessly, as he often did when the weight of his responsibilities became too much to bear. His thoughts were scattered, half on the day's negotiations, half on the hollow feeling he tried so hard to ignore. Stopping at a traffic light near the bridge, something caught his eye. Beneath a makeshift awning, Emily sat on the ground, gripping her sketchbook with hands trembling from the cold. The dim light of a nearby street lamp cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting a blend of resilience and weariness in her expression. For Ethan, it was as if time froze. He couldn't look away, as if trying to understand why this fleeting moment struck something deep within him. Before he could fully process the feeling, his phone rang, breaking the silence in the car. It was his assistant, insistent on reviewing the final details of the next day's transaction. Ethan answered, his gaze reluctantly shifting from Emily. By the time the call ended, the traffic light had changed, and the cars behind him were urging him forward. With reluctance, he drove on, leaving the bridge behind. But the image of Emily stayed with him. Her eyes, even from a distance, seemed to ask a silent question he couldn't ignore. Back in his penthouse, Ethan tried to focus on the documents before him, yet his mind kept drifting back to that solitary figure in the rain. Who was she? How had she ended up there? And why did it matter so much to him, a man who prided himself on keeping other people's problems at arm's length? The next morning, Ethan sat at the dining table in his sprawling glass-walled apartment, with the panoramic cityscape spread before him. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched. Normally, he would start his day by scanning emails, but this time, his mind was elsewhere, on the girl under the bridge. He didn't even know her name, but the mix of vulnerability and determination in her gaze had left a mark he couldn't shake. Later at the office, Ethan struggled to focus. Meetings and conference calls rolled by as usual, but the emotional detachment he usually wore like armor felt unusually thin. During a rare lunch break, he found himself staring out of his window, wondering if it was time to break away from his rigid routine. Though he wasn't sure what that might look like. Meanwhile, Emily was back in the park, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, her eyes scanning the damp surroundings for inspiration. Rain-soaked trees, hurried families, and the occasional glint of sunlight breaking through the clouds provided the backdrop for her art. Drawing was her way of making sense of the world, and today, more than ever, she needed that sense of purpose. After finishing a sketch, Emily closed her notebook and walked to the cafe where she helped in exchange for food. Sam, the owner, always greeted her with a warm smile. "Emily, have you brought more of your drawings to put up on the wall?" He gestured to the corner dedicated to her creations, where curious customers often stopped to admire her work. "I have," she replied, handing him 3 new pieces. Sam examined them closely, nodding with approval. "These are incredible, as always. You've got a real gift, you know." Emily smiled and thanked him, but she avoided lingering in the conversation. Though she appreciated Sam's support, she knew her life was far removed from any recognition her art might bring. As the day dragged on, Emily began contemplating ways to escape her situation. But the barriers seemed insurmountable: no home, no family, and, above all, a society that often treated her as invisible. Yet, the desire for something better refused to fade. While Emily was searching for strength to carry on, Ethan was doing something out of character. That evening, instead of heading straight home after work, he chose to take the same route he had the night before. The drive to the bridge felt like an unconscious attempt to find answers to questions he couldn't even articulate. When he arrived, she wasn't there. The spot was empty, save for an old blanket left behind and a few crumpled pieces of paper scattered by the rain. Ethan parked the car and stepped out, glancing around as though expecting her to appear at any moment. He couldn't explain why he cared so much, but her absence left him with an odd sense of emptiness. Back in his car, Ethan picked up one of the damp sheets from the ground. It was a sketch, a fragment of London in the rain, rendered in vibrant colors that seemed to breathe life into the scene. Without fully understanding why, Ethan tucked the drawing into the inside pocket of his coat and drove home. In the days that followed, Ethan became increasingly restless, as though something crucial was missing from his carefully ordered routine. He spent more time than he cared to admit staring at the sketch he had found under the bridge, imagining the hands that had created it and the world they captured. Every line seemed to hold a fragment of a soul, a depth that was absent from his own life. The drawing, now dried and carefully placed on his desk, became a kind of anchor for thoughts he wasn't yet able to articulate. His restlessness didn't go unnoticed. During a meeting, his assistant, Lucas, made an offhand remark: "You've seemed a bit distracted lately, boss. Everything all right?" Ethan dismissed the question with a cold smile and a quick reply. He wasn't ready to admit that a fleeting encounter with a stranger in the rain had unsettled him so deeply. Meanwhile, Emily faced yet another challenging week. Her days sketching in the park and her nights searching for stable shelter grew even more difficult as a harsh winter began to set in. In a moment of desperation, she considered giving up on her art and looking for any job she could find. But she quickly discarded the thought. Drawing was the only thing that made her feel there was still beauty in the world, a reminder that she had something to offer, even if no one seemed to notice. One afternoon, while rearranging her drawings on the cafe wall, Emily noticed a customer studying her work intently. The woman, who appeared sophisticated and well-dressed, approached Sam and asked, "Who's the artist?" With his usual enthusiasm, Sam pointed to Emily. "This talented young woman. Can you believe she creates all this while facing unimaginable difficulties?" The woman walked over to Emily, extending a hand with a warm smile. "My name's Clara. I'm an art curator, and, well, I think your work is extraordinary. Have you ever considered exhibiting your pieces in a gallery?" Emily hesitated. The offer felt surreal, an opportunity that didn't align with her reality. Yet something in Clara's earnest expression made her promise to think about it. While Emily was mulling over this new possibility, Ethan gave in to his curiosity. He returned to the cafe where he often found a moment's respite from the office, but this time with a purpose: to uncover the origins of the sketch that had been haunting his thoughts. The place was small and inviting, with worn wooden tables and the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee filling the air. As he stepped inside, his eyes were immediately drawn to a wall adorned with drawings. He recognized the style at once. It was unmistakably the same artist who had created the sketch he now carried with him. He moved closer, studying the intricate lines and vibrant colors. Each piece seemed to tell its own story, yet together they formed a tapestry of emotions and experiences. Sam, the cafe owner, noticed Ethan's interest from behind the counter. "Beautiful, aren't they? These are all Emily's. She's been coming here for months now. A very talented young woman." The name resonated in Ethan's mind like a revelation. Emily. Now she had a name, and it made her seem all the more real. "Is she here today?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though the anticipation in his voice betrayed him. "Not at the moment, but she's in most days. Stick around, and I'm sure you'll meet her." Ethan nodded his thanks and ordered a coffee, deciding to wait. He settled at a table near the window, watching the world go by as the hum of conversation and soft music filled the room. He had no idea what he'd say when he met her, but something told him this connection, however improbable, had a purpose. As he waited, Ethan alternated between glancing at his phone and examining the drawings on the wall. Each new piece he studied seemed to reveal a story, drawing him deeper into a world so vivid and heartfelt it stood in stark contrast to his own, where everything felt rehearsed and hollow. When Emily finally arrived, carrying her sketchbook and wearing an old coat that barely kept out the cold, Ethan felt the atmosphere shift. She entered quietly, moving with the kind of grace that came from wanting to go unnoticed. Sam greeted her with his usual warm smile, and she returned it with a shy nod. She walked to the counter, unaware of Ethan's presence, and began rearranging the drawings on the wall, swapping out older ones for her latest creations. Ethan hesitated. He was a man used to billion-pound negotiations and snap decisions, but in that moment, uncertainty tied a knot in his throat. Taking a deep breath, he finally stood and approached her. "Excuse me," he began, his voice steady but kind. "These drawings, they're yours, aren't they?" Emily turned slowly, surprised that someone was addressing her directly. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, she hesitated, as if trying to gauge his intentions. "Yes, they are mine," she replied softly. I found one of them," Ethan said, reaching into his coat's inner pocket and pulling out the sketch he'd picked up on the rainy night by the bridge. "It was under a bridge during the rain. I think you might have dropped it." Emily's eyes widened as she recognized the drawing. "Oh. I didn't realize I'd lost it." She took the paper carefully, as though handling something fragile. "Thank you. This one's one of my favorites." Ethan smiled, relieved that she didn't seem uncomfortable. "It's incredible. The lines, the colors, it's like you see the world in a way most people don't." I couldn't stop thinking about it. Emily blinked, taken aback by the unexpected praise. It wasn't often that someone acknowledged the value of what she created, let alone someone who seemed to come from such a different world. "Thank you," she said again, her voice a bit steadier this time. "Have you been doing this for long?" Ethan asked, keen to keep the conversation going. "Always, I think," Emily said, glancing at the sketchbook she held. "Drawing is what keeps me connected, you know. Sometimes it's the only thing that makes sense." Ethan nodded, feeling an unexpected resonance with her words. He couldn't explain it, but this simple, unassuming conversation felt more genuine than many of the interactions he'd had in years. Sam, who had been observing the scene from behind the counter, approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Here you go, on the house. You both deserve this." Emily glanced at Sam with gratitude before turning her attention back to Ethan. "You seem different from the usual people who stop to look at my drawings. What brought you here?" Ethan hesitated for a moment. The real answer was too complicated to sum up in a few words. "I suppose I was looking for something," he said finally. "And maybe I found it." Emily didn't know how to respond, but for the first time in what felt like ages, she had the sense that someone truly saw her. She cupped the warm coffee with both hands, letting the heat ease the persistent chill in her fingers. Her eyes settled on Ethan, who looked slightly out of place, as if unsure how to carry on the conversation. There was something hard to pin down about him, polite, curious, but also hesitant, like someone venturing into uncharted territory. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "what is it you do? I mean, you seem different. It's not every day someone like you takes an interest in drawings like mine." Ethan chuckled softly, not because the question was amusing, but because, in a way, she was right. He'd never taken an interest in art or anything remotely similar until he found that sketch under the bridge. "I'm a businessman," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "I work in tech. A very different field from yours, I imagine." Emily nodded, doing her best not to let her thoughts show. His answer confirmed some of her suspicions. A successful businessman, sitting here with her, praising her drawings? It seemed unlikely he was just curious. Maybe he wanted to offer her something, a job, an opportunity, some kind of charity disguised as genuine interest. It was hard not to be cynical, given everything she'd been through. Yet, a small part of her couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. What if he did want to help her? What if this meeting was the start of something that could finally lift her out of the streets? "Are you here because you want to offer me something?" she asked directly, her voice carrying a trace of nervousness. Ethan frowned, caught off guard by the question. "Offer you something?" he repeated, confused. He quickly realized what she was implying, and a slight discomfort settled over him. That wasn't why he was there, not in the traditional sense, at least. He wasn't trying to save her or extend charity. What he felt was something deeper, something he couldn't quite articulate. "I don't know," he admitted, his tone honest. "Maybe I just wanted to meet the person behind the drawings. They made me think. And I don't think anything's made me do that in a long time." Ethan's candor took Emily by surprise. She'd expected a more polished answer, perhaps even a formal proposition. But the way he looked at her, with a mixture of curiosity and vulnerability, seemed sincere. Despite her instinct to stay guarded, something in her began to soften. "Well," she said with a small smile, "I'm glad my drawings made you think. They're all I have to give to the world." Ethan smiled in return, though he was still wrestling with his own feelings. He knew there was something different about Emily, something that drew him in unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. But how could he explain that without sounding contrived or out of place? After all, they came from completely different worlds, and he barely knew her. "Maybe I could see more of your work," he suggested, trying to keep the tone light. "If you wouldn't mind, of course." Emily hesitated, still wary but feeling a spark of excitement at the same time. "I don't mind," she said at last. "But only if you're not here with ulterior motives." Ethan laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No ulterior motives. Just genuine interest." And so, they continued talking, each trying to make sense of the other. Emily wrestled with the distrust life on the streets had instilled in her, while Ethan tried to understand why this girl, so unlike anyone he knew, had made such an impact on him. As they talked, Ethan began noticing details he hadn't picked up on before. Emily's coat was visibly worn, with makeshift patches on the sleeves. Her boots, ill-fitting, looked at least 2 sizes too big, and her fingertips were slightly red, likely from enduring the cold every day. "Do you always draw in the park?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light while taking in what he saw. "Yeah," she replied, tugging her sleeves down to cover her hands better. "It's the only place where I can sit in peace and watch people. Sometimes Sam lets me draw here in the cafe too, but I don't want to impose on him too much." Ethan frowned. He thought about the park he often passed during his morning walks, lovely in summer but bleak and unforgiving in the winter. How could anyone spend hours there in the cold, especially in clothes that barely provided warmth? He wanted to ask more but hesitated, worried about coming across as intrusive. And after the park, he ventured, trying to sound casual. Emily glanced away, her eyes fixed on the rim of her coffee cup. "After that, I try to find somewhere to sleep. Sometimes there's space in a shelter, other times, it's wherever I can manage." The simplicity of her answer left Ethan unsettled. For him, the thought of sleeping rough, not knowing where or how he'd spend the night, was almost unimaginable. He'd never stopped to think about the realities people like Emily faced, let alone confronted them directly. "Don't you have anyone to help you?" he asked, immediately regretting it, worried it might sound insensitive. "No," she said with a neutral tone, though a faint sadness underpinned her words. "I lost my parents a few years ago, and the rest, well, there isn't anyone left." Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a pang in his chest he couldn't quite describe. He thought about his own life, the comforts, the luxuries, the ability to solve almost any problem with money. And here was Emily, facing each day with nothing but a sketchbook and an unyielding desire to create something beautiful. He glanced at her hands again, noticing the cracked nails, a small cut on her index finger, and the dry, chapped skin caused by the cold. These weren't the hands of someone living, but of someone enduring. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly, not realizing the words had escaped him. Emily looked up, surprised by his frankness. "I don't know," she admitted. "Sometimes I think I won't manage. But then I draw. And it gives me enough strength for another day." Ethan stayed quiet. He felt humbled in her presence. Until now, he'd never truly thought about the people he passed on the streets every day. To him, they had been part of the city's backdrop, a distant, uncomfortable reality he avoided confronting. But now, sitting across from Emily, with the evidence of her struggle etched into every detail, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what it meant to survive as she did. When Emily began gathering her sketchbook and getting ready to leave, Ethan felt a sudden urge. He wanted to say something, do something, but he wasn't sure what. He didn't want her to see him as someone pitying her. That wasn't what he felt. It was something deeper, more urgent. "Emily," he said before she stood. Can I see you again? I mean, maybe tomorrow, at the park. I'd really like to see more of your work. If you don't mind." She regarded him for a moment, weighing his words. "If you want," she said at last. "I'll be there." As she left, Ethan remained seated, lost in thought. For the first time, he began to see a world he'd never truly acknowledged, a world Emily carried with her in every drawing and every word. The next day, Ethan woke earlier than usual. The morning was cold, and a light mist veiled the city, softening the sharp edges of the streets. He rushed through breakfast, a stark contrast to his usual methodical routine. There was something different about this day, a sense of urgency he couldn't quite name. but that propelled him toward the park. When he arrived, he found Emily sitting on her usual bench, her sketchbook already open and a pencil in hand. Her hair was tied back haphazardly, and she wore the same worn coat from the night before. Yet she seemed completely absorbed in her work, as though the cold and the chaos around her couldn't touch her while she sketched. Ethan hesitated before approaching, watching her for a moment. Every stroke she made seemed deliberate, as though she was breathing life into the paper. Finally, he gathered his courage and sat beside her. "Morning," he said, breaking the silence. Emily glanced up briefly, offering a small smile. "You actually came." "I said I would," he replied, trying to hide his nervousness. "What are you drawing?" She turned the sketchbook towards him, revealing a depiction of the park. But it wasn't an ordinary drawing. Emily had transformed the cold, grey setting into something vibrant and inviting. The leafless trees seemed to dance in the wind, the benches and pathways had a nearly magical texture. Ethan was stunned. "That's incredible," he said sincerely. "You've got a way of seeing the world that I didn't even know was possible." Emily shrugged, her eyes returning to the page. "I just try to find beauty where I can. Sometimes it's the only thing that feels worth it." Ethan didn't respond straight away. He glanced around the park, trying to see it as she did. It wasn't easy, but somehow, it felt important. "Have you ever thought about doing something bigger with this?" he asked carefully. "I mean, your drawings, they deserve to be seen by more people." Emily let out a short, almost bitter laugh. "And how exactly would I do that? It's not like people are lining up to see work from someone like me." "Don't underestimate the impact you could have," Ethan said, leaning forward slightly. "Maybe people just need a chance to see what you've got to offer." She looked at him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "You talk like someone who's used to opening doors for people. Is that easy for you?" Ethan smiled, acknowledging her point. "Maybe it is. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be for you too. If you're open to it, I'd like to help." Emily narrowed her eyes, studying him. "Why? Why do you care?" The question hung in the air, and Ethan felt the weight of needing to answer honestly. He could sense that Emily wasn't used to trusting people, and anything that felt insincere would push her away. "Because I think the world needs more beautiful things," he said finally. "And I think you're someone who can create them." Emily stayed silent, her gaze dropping back to the sketchbook. For a moment, Ethan thought she might ignore him entirely. But then she closed the book, resting it on her lap, and looked directly at him. "All right," she said. "I'll accept your help. But only if this doesn't become about you. I'm not some charity project." "I don't want you to be," Ethan replied earnestly. They sat there for a while longer, saying little but sharing a growing sense of understanding. For Ethan, it felt like the start of something transformative. For Emily, it was a chance to see if there was more to life than just getting by. In the days that followed, Ethan and Emily began meeting regularly at the park. Sometimes he simply watched her draw, trying to grasp what inspired her. Other times, they chatted about small, inconsequential things, the weather, passers-by, the sounds of the city. Despite the simplicity of their conversations, a genuine connection grew between them, built on mutual respect and curiosity. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. He saw potential in Emily that deserved to be recognized, but he also worried about overstepping and losing her trust. Knowing how resistant she was to anything resembling charity, he began thinking of subtle ways to support her. One afternoon, As she showed him a new drawing, a misty view of the Thames transformed into something almost ethereal. An idea struck him. "Emily," he began, trying not to sound too eager, "have you heard of the Winter Gallery? They host an annual exhibition for emerging artists." She frowned, a mix of curiosity and skepticism crossing her face. "I've heard of it, I think. But, Ethan, that's not for someone like me. It's for real artists." "And who says you're not a real artist?" he countered, smiling as he leaned slightly closer. "I had a chat with someone from there, just to find out how it works. All you need to do is submit 3 drawings, and they decide from there. What's the harm in trying?" Emily looked at him, her eyes scrutinizing his words. "You've already spoken to them?" "I have," he admitted without hesitation. "But don't worry, I didn't mention your name. I just wanted to understand the process. The rest is up to you." She stayed quiet for a moment, staring at the sketchbook in her lap. Part of her wanted to dismiss the idea outright, too afraid to face yet another rejection. But another part, the part that still believed in small possibilities, felt tempted. "What if I'm not good enough?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You are," Ethan said firmly, catching her off guard. "I know you are. But more importantly, you deserve for the world to see what you've got to offer." After a long pause, she nodded. "All right. I'll try. But only because you're so determined." Ethan smiled, relief and excitement washing over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this small step felt like a victory. That night, as Ethan drove home, he felt a mix of nervousness and purpose. He'd never become this involved in someone else's life before, especially someone so far removed from his world. But with Emily, it seemed impossible not to care. Meanwhile, Emily spent hours going through her drawings, trying to decide which ones to send. Every line held a piece of her story, but she didn't know which would be the strongest, the most meaningful. Sam, the cafe owner, noticed her hesitation as she worked in a corner of the shop. "Emily," he said, placing a cup of tea beside her, "you know you've got something special, don't you? No matter what happens, you're already incredible just for trying." She smiled, feeling a flicker of courage stir inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. Over the following days, Emily and Ethan worked together to submit the drawings to the gallery. For Ethan, it was a way to show her she deserved more than the world had given her so far. For Emily, it was a chance to prove to herself that there was still something worth striving for. The journey was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, they both felt like they were heading towards something bigger than they could imagine. 2 weeks passed since Emily's drawings were sent to the Winter Gallery. The silence of the wait was almost unbearable. For Emily, each day felt like a test of patience, the uncertainty pulling at her emotions. She oscillated between timid hope and the overwhelming fear of rejection. Ethan did his best to distract her, spending more time with her at the park and the cafe, but he knew nothing could truly ease her anxiety. Finally, on a cold morning, as Emily was adjusting her drawings on the cafe wall, Sam approached her with an envelope in hand. "This came for you, Emily," he said, smiling warmly. She froze, recognizing the gallery's logo in the corner of the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly. As she took it, Ethan, who had arrived just minutes earlier, stood by her side, watching silently. "Do you want to open it now?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with anticipation. Emily took a deep breath and nodded. Carefully, she opened the envelope and slid out a single sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the letter, and for a moment, she remained still, as if unable to process the words. "Well?" Sam asked, his curiosity shining through. I got in, Emily said at last, her voice low and full of disbelief. Ethan broke into a broad smile, a wave of relief and happiness washing over him. I told you, you're good enough. Emily looked at him, her eyes glistening. They want me to display 3 drawings next week, she said, still processing the news. Ethan, is this real? It's real, he replied, genuinely moved. In the days that followed, Emily's life became a whirlwind of activity. Between choosing the drawings she'd present, preparing her materials, and managing her growing anxiety, she barely had time to think about anything else. Ethan helped in every way he could, from organizing her work to ensuring she had suitable clothes for the event. On the night of the gallery opening, Emily was visibly nervous. She wore a simple yet elegant dress that Sam and Ethan had insisted on buying for her. Her hair, usually tied back in a rushed bun, was loose and neatly styled. She hardly recognized herself when she looked in the mirror. You look stunning, Ethan said as he walked alongside her to the venue. I don't know if I can do this, Emily murmured, her hands clutching nervously at the strap of her bag. You already have, he replied. You've made it this far. Now it's just about showing the world what I already know, that you're amazing. When they arrived at the gallery, Emily was greeted by Clara, the curator who had first recognized her talent weeks earlier in the cafe. Clara led her through the space, where her drawings were displayed alongside other works. Seeing her art framed and lit on a professional wall felt almost surreal. The evening started quietly, but before long, the room filled with guests, critics, and art enthusiasts. Emily found herself receiving compliments she'd never dreamed of hearing, each word boosting her confidence. Ethan lingered at the back of the room, watching as she interacted with visitors. He felt a pride he couldn't quite describe, mixed with an odd sense of detachment. As much as he wanted to stay by her side, he knew this night belonged to her. And perhaps he was starting to realize something he hadn't yet admitted to himself: Emily didn't need him to shine. The exhibition was a resounding success. 2 of Emily's drawings sold, and Clara proposed including her work in a catalogue for emerging artists. It was more than Emily had ever dared to hope for. That night, as Ethan drove her back to the cafe, Emily finally spoke. Ethan, thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything. I wouldn't have had the courage to do this without you. You've always had courage, Emily, he said with a small smile. I just helped you see it. As the car pulled up outside the cafe, they sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Emily felt a warmth that came not only from the success of the night, but from something deeper, a connection she was still trying to understand. Ethan, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that what he felt for her went far beyond admiration. Their worlds were shifting, and both of them knew this was just the first of many nights that would redefine their lives. In the days following the exhibition, Emily continued to receive praise and opportunities. Clara got back in touch to confirm that her drawings would be included in the gallery's catalogue and even suggested the possibility of a future solo exhibition. It was all new to Emily, and while she was excited, the weight of the changes was beginning to set in. Ethan remained close, quietly supporting her from the sidelines, but he was also grappling with his feelings. The more time he spent with Emily, the more he felt his heart tighten. The way she furrowed her brow in thought, how her shy smile lit up a room, or the simple way she viewed the world, all of it drew him to her in a way he could no longer ignore. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park, Emily was distracted, chatting about a new idea for a drawing she wanted to explore. Ethan, however, found it hard to focus on her words. All he could see was the passion in her eyes as she described her vision. "You're incredible, you know that," he said suddenly, cutting her off mid-sentence. Emily stopped and looked at him, startled. "What?" "You," he repeated, this time with more confidence. "What you do, the way you see the world, it's incredible. I keep wondering how I got lucky enough to meet someone like you." She laughed nervously, looking away. "Ethan, you're overreacting. I'm just me. And that's enough," he said, stepping closer. "I just wanted you to know that." Emily felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to such heartfelt compliments, especially from someone like Ethan. While part of her wanted to brush off his words, another part felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. "Really?" The moment was interrupted by a sudden gust of cold wind, and Emily pulled her coat tighter around herself. Without a word, Ethan removed his scarf and gently wrapped it around her neck before she could protest. "You'll catch a cold," he said with a smile. Emily looked up at him, trying to read his intentions. There was something different in Ethan's eyes, something more intense, more personal. She felt a mix of nervousness and comfort, a sensation she didn't quite know how to process. That night, as Ethan dropped her off at the cafe, he hesitated before saying goodbye. "Emily," he started, gripping the steering wheel a bit harder than necessary. "Yes?" She turned to him. "Have you ever thought about leaving all of this behind? I mean, getting off the streets, starting fresh. Having a place of your own." Emily stared at him, caught off guard by the question. She had imagined it before, of course, but it always felt like a distant dream, something almost impossible. "I think about it," she admitted. "But it's not that simple. These things cost money, and I'm still trying to find my footing." Ethan took a deep breath. He wanted to offer his help, to tell her he'd do anything to get her out of that situation. But he knew Emily was proud, and anything that sounded like charity would be met with resistance. "I think you deserve better," he said at last. She smiled, touched by his concern. "Thank you, Ethan. I know you want to help, and that means a lot to me." As she stepped out of the car and into the cafe, Ethan sat there for a moment, staring at the closed door. He knew he was falling for Emily, but he also knew he'd need to find a way to show her without overstepping or overwhelming her. Over the following days, Ethan began to let his feelings show, albeit cautiously. He took her to places she'd never seen before, showing her parts of the city she hadn't experienced, and he never missed a chance to remind her of how much he admired her strength. For Emily, it was both exhilarating and confusing. She felt something growing between them, but the fear of opening up, of trusting fully, remained a constant barrier. Their bond deepened, and both of them knew they were approaching a crossroads where their feelings would have to be acknowledged, and what it meant for their lives. It was a cold evening, the London sky heavy with dense clouds threatening rain. Ethan and Emily strolled through the softly lit streets, their path familiar after another afternoon at the park. Their conversation flowed easily, but something felt different. Ethan seemed distant, as though carefully weighing every word before speaking. Emily noticed the unusual silence and glanced at him. "Are you all right? You seem lost in thought." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. For a moment, he just looked at her, summoning the courage for what he needed to say. The words had been building inside him for days, maybe even weeks, and now they felt impossible to hold back. "Emily, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. She stopped as well, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" Ethan stepped closer, closing the space between them. He took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back now. I know we come from completely different worlds. I know my life and yours were never supposed to intersect. But since I met you, nothing's felt the same. Emily blinked, surprised, but she didn't interrupt. I see you, Emily, he continued, his voice gaining strength. Not just what you create, but who you are. Your strength, your resilience, the way you bring light into the world even when it feels like everything's against you. I've never met anyone like you. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the scarf he'd given her days earlier. Ethan, I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words spilling out at last. And, if I'm honest, I think I have been for a while. I just didn't know how to say it. But now, I can't keep it to myself anymore. The silence that followed felt endless. Emily's heart raced, but not in a comforting way. His words, as sincere and beautiful as they were, stirred fears she had worked hard to bury. Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling, you don't understand what you're saying. I do, he insisted, taking another step closer. And I know this might seem impossible to you, but it's the truth. You deserve to be loved, Emily, and I want to be the one to love you. She took a step back, shaking her head. No, you don't understand. My life, my reality isn't something you can just overlook. You might think you feel something for me now, but this isn't real, Ethan. You're caught up in a moment, and her voice broke, and she turned her face away, unable to meet his gaze. Ethan reached out but stopped short, sensing how tense she was. Emily, please, just listen to me, he pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. I'm not here to save you or change you. I just want to be by your side. She took another step back, putting distance between them. Ethan, you can't. My life's too complicated, and I don't know if I can handle this, or you. Without waiting for his response, Emily turned and walked away, her quick steps echoing on the quiet street. Ethan stayed rooted to the spot, the cold air pressing against him as he watched her retreating figure. He knew she was scared to trust, to get hurt, to open herself to something that felt impossible. As Emily disappeared around the corner, a deep emptiness settled over Ethan. He didn't know what to say or do to convince her his feelings were real, but he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't giving up that easily. That night, Ethan returned to his flat feeling more hollow than he ever had before. He spent hours standing by the expansive window of his penthouse, staring out at the city lights. London, usually alive and buzzing, now felt like an empty shell. His confession to Emily had been honest, and he knew he hadn't spoken out of selfishness. But her rejection, no matter how much he understood it, left him utterly devastated. The next day, he tried to focus on work, but his mind simply wouldn't cooperate. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily walking away, her words echoing in his head, my reality isn't something you can just ignore. He didn't want to ignore her reality, he wanted to face it with her, to prove that they could navigate it together if she let him. Emily, meanwhile, spent the day in the park with her sketchbook resting on her lap, unable to draw. Ethan's face kept appearing in her mind, along with the words he'd spoken, his sincerity, and the look in his eyes when he told her how he felt. I'm falling in love with you. She shook her head, trying to push the memory away, but it was no use. She knew Ethan wasn't like anyone she'd met before. He didn't treat her like a charity case or someone beneath him. He truly saw her. And that was exactly why she was so hesitant. What does someone like him want with me? She muttered, her hands gripping the pencil tightly. She thought about Ethan's luxurious flat, the expensive cars, the life he led, a life she couldn't even begin to imagine. It terrified her. No matter how much she wanted to believe his feelings were genuine, a persistent doubt gnawed at her confidence. What if he gets tired of me? What if one day he realizes he deserves someone who fits into his world? Emily tried to justify her reaction. She hadn't turned Ethan down because she didn't feel anything for him. In truth, it was the opposite. He made her feel things she didn't know how to handle. But the fear of their differences, of future rejection, of it all being temporary and leaving her even more broken, was overwhelming. "I'm just not enough," she admitted quietly, her voice trembling as her eyes burned with unshed tears. She knew she was running away, but it felt easier to protect herself by keeping him at arm's length than to risk building something that might eventually crumble. Yet, the memory of Ethan's face when she walked away refused to leave her. 2 days had passed since Emily had distanced herself from Ethan, but for him, each hour felt like a lifetime. He tried to convince himself that he needed to respect her space, even if it meant never seeing her again. But deep down, a part of him resisted the idea of giving up. That afternoon, as he wandered aimlessly through the streets of London, he found himself walking towards the little cafe where Emily often spent her time. It was as though his feet had decided on their own, leading him there without any conscious thought. When he pushed open the door, the familiar sound of the bell greeted him, along with the warmth and comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Across the room, Emily was adjusting one of her drawings on the wall, moving with a sort of absent-minded focus. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice Ethan enter. He, however, saw her immediately. For him, her presence seemed to fill the room, making everything else fade into the background. "Emily," Ethan called softly, his voice just loud enough to reach her. She froze at the sound of her name, turning slowly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire world had stopped. The memory of his words came rushing back to her like a storm. Ethan began, but before he could say anything more, Emily let the drawing he was holding slip from her fingers and bolted for the door. "Emily, wait!" Ethan called after her, but she was already outside, the door slamming shut behind her. From behind the counter, Sam watched the scene unfold, his expression a mix of concern and sympathy. "She's scared, you know," he said gently. "Not of you, but of what you represent. Give her time." Ethan exhaled deeply, the weight on his chest almost unbearable. For a long moment, he stood there, motionless, trying to figure out what to do next. Emily clearly needed space, but the thought of letting her go completely felt impossible. As he walked home, the same question played over and over in his mind, impossible to answer. Should he keep trying, or let Emily find her own way? That night, sitting in his living room, Ethan reflected on everything that had happened since he'd met her. She had changed him in ways he never imagined, opening his eyes to a world he barely acknowledged before. But was it fair to keep pushing? "I don't want to be someone who pressures her," he said aloud, as if trying to convince himself. "But I also don't want to give up." Finally, he made a decision. He would give Emily the space she seemed to need, but wouldn't abandon the possibility of showing her how genuine his feelings were. He would wait, with patience and respect. Emily spent the next few days avoiding places where she might run into Ethan. The cafe, once her refuge, now felt like a dangerous space, filled with memories and the potential for confrontation. She knew running from him that afternoon had been cowardly, but she didn't know how to handle the emotions he stirred in her. Every word Ethan had said was etched into her mind. "I see you." Those words, so simple yet so profound, made her question everything. Why did he see her? Why did he care? And why couldn't she just accept it? Meanwhile, Ethan stayed true to his decision to respect Emily's space, though her absence weighed heavily on him. He continued going to the park, hoping to catch a glimpse of her from a distance, even knowing she was likely avoiding him. The separation didn't diminish his feelings, in fact, it seemed to strengthen them. One evening, Sam called Ethan. The cafe owner rarely reached out directly, and the unexpected call caught Ethan off guard. "Ethan," Sam said in his calm, familiar tone, "Emily came by today. She looked unsure, but she asked about you. I think she's trying to figure things out." Ethan's heart raced. "Did she say anything else?" "Not much. Just that she missed drawing here, but wasn't sure if she should come back." "Thanks, Sam. That means a lot," Ethan replied before hanging up. That same night, Emily sat in the small shelter where she'd managed to secure a spot. Her sketchbook rested on her lap, but she couldn't bring herself to draw. Instead, she stared at the blank page as if it were a mirror reflecting her own indecision. "Why hasn't he given up yet?" she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She thought about Ethan's life, filled with endless opportunities and resources, while hers felt like an unrelenting fight for survival. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. What truly paralyzed her was the fear that if she let Ethan into her life, she might lose him someday. And that would hurt more than anything she'd ever faced. "I feel something for him," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible. But what if that's not enough? Across the city, Ethan did something he never thought he would. He grabbed the notebook where he usually jotted down ideas for his business and began writing about Emily. It wasn't a plan or a strategy, but a stream of thoughts, feelings he couldn't quite articulate aloud. Ethan wrote about how she made the world feel more alive, how simply watching her draw gave him a new perspective. He wrote about how much he wanted to be by her side, not to fix her life, but to share his own with her. When he finished, he read it all back to himself. It was raw, honest, and, above all, real. Carefully, he tucked the notebook away, deciding he would give it to her when the time felt right. The next day, Emily finally returned to the cafe. Sam greeted her with his usual warm smile, but there was something in his expression that hinted things had shifted. She noticed Ethan's absence immediately. He wasn't there every day, but his presence had become something she anticipated, even as she tried to avoid it. "Has he been by?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Sam shook his head. "Not the last few days. Seems like he's busy." Across the city, Ethan was buried under stacks of reports and charts in his expansive meeting room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as the sound of clicking keyboards and murmured conversations filled the air. A team of consultants discussed strategies for expanding into a new international market. "Mr. Hayes, we need your final approval to move forward with the acquisition," said Lucas, his assistant, handing over a folder of documents. Ethan scanned the papers briefly, but his mind was elsewhere. For days, he had thrown himself into work, using it as a shield to forget about Emily. His company had always demanded his attention, but now it served as a distraction. Yet, no matter how engrossed he became in corporate chaos, thoughts of her kept surfacing, like a beacon he couldn't ignore. "Mr. Hayes?" Lucas prompted again, breaking his reverie. Ethan blinked and nodded. "Yes. Right. Let's proceed." The meeting continued, but Ethan felt increasingly disconnected. He had always been a focused leader, praised for his strategic vision and decisive nature. But now, for the first time in years, his mind was somewhere else, or, rather, with someone else. As the days dragged on, work only became more demanding. An unexpected crisis in one of their international markets required Ethan's immediate attention. He spent countless nights at the office, poring over contracts and coordinating responses. His team noticed the shift in him. Though still efficient, he seemed more withdrawn than usual. "Are you all right, sir?" Lucas asked during a rare pause between meetings. Ethan looked at him for a moment, considering whether to be truthful. But, as always, he opted to maintain his composure. "I'm fine. Just tired. If you need to step away, I'm sure we can handle things," Lucas offered. "I know," Ethan replied, offering a faint smile. "But I'd rather see it through." While Ethan drowned himself in work, Emily wrestled with her own emotional battle. Every passing day, thoughts of Ethan and the words he had spoken lingered in her mind. She knew she should move on, focus on her life, and forget about it all. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase the memory of him, the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel seen and valued. That afternoon, as she finished a sketch in the park, Emily made an impulsive decision. "I need to see him," she said aloud, as if speaking the words made them more real. Gathering her things, she headed to the cafe, hoping to find Ethan. When she arrived, the place was busy, with its usual mix of customers scattered around the tables. Sam was bustling behind the counter. "Hi, Sam," Emily said, attempting to sound nonchalant. "Has Ethan been in?" Sam glanced at her, offering a kind smile, but shook his head. "No, not recently. I think he's tied up with work." Emily felt a pang of disappointment. She had expected it to be difficult to track him down, but hearing it made her realize just how much she missed him. "Do you want to leave a message?" Sam asked, watching her carefully. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "No. I just wanted to see him." She left the cafe feeling strangely adrift. Ethan seemed so far away, and for the first time, she began to realize that his distance might have been caused by her own actions. The days remained frantic at Hayes Technologies, but something was different. Ethan, once renowned for his precision and quick decision-making, seemed off his game. Small mistakes began creeping into his work, decisions delayed, details overlooked, and the team, reliant on his leadership, started feeling the ripple effects. That week, during a critical presentation to investors, Ethan let a key strategic detail about international expansion slip through the cracks. It was the kind of information he would usually handle effortlessly, but his distracted mind left Lucas scrambling to step in and salvage the situation. "Mr. Hayes," one of the investors said after the meeting, "I'm sure everything's under control, but hesitation like this could unsettle the market. We're counting on your leadership to maintain confidence." Ethan nodded with a tight smile, but inside, he was frustrated with himself. He knew he was falling short of the standards he'd always set. Later that afternoon, Lucas stepped into his office, a report in hand. "Ethan," he began, using the casual tone that years of familiarity allowed, "we need to talk." Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling. "Let me guess. I'm not delivering." Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Honestly?" "No, you're not. The team's concerned. You're mentally checked out, delaying important decisions, and it's starting to show. Shares dropped 2% yesterday, and the rumors are already flying." Ethan ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of Lucas's words. He knew his assistant was right. "I know," he admitted at last. "I'm just dealing with some personal stuff." "I understand," Lucas replied, his tone softening. "But with all due respect, the Ethan Hayes we know never let personal matters affect his work. Whatever this is, it's different." Ethan sat in silence, staring at the graphs on his computer screen. He wanted to tell Lucas what was going on, to explain how Emily had entered his life and turned it upside down. But he knew it wouldn't help. This was an internal battle, and he had to face it alone. "I'll sort it out," he promised, though his voice lacked conviction. Meanwhile, Emily was searching for a way to reconnect with Ethan. She returned to the cafe every day, hoping to see him, but Sam always gave her the same answer: "He hasn't been by." Each day without news only deepened her anxiety. That night, sitting in her small corner at the shelter, Emily thought about the impact Ethan had had on her life. He had brought something she hadn't expected: hope. But now, it felt like that hope was slipping away in the growing distance between them. "Has he already given up on me?" she whispered to herself, clutching her sketchbook tightly to her chest. Across the city, Ethan was alone in his penthouse, staring out at the illuminated skyline. He knew he needed to refocus, to set his priorities straight, but the thought of leaving Emily behind felt impossible. She wasn't just a distraction or an obstacle, she was someone who had awakened something in him he hadn't known existed. The Hayes Technologies offices were in chaos. News of Ethan's lackluster performance had reached the media, and shareholders were growing restless. Lucas called an emergency meeting with the senior executives, hoping Ethan could reassert control of the situation. That morning, Ethan walked into the boardroom, his expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. He knew he was on thin ice. Lucas and the rest of the team watched as he took his place at the head of the table, adjusting his tie. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult," he began, his voice steady but laced with honesty. "I'll admit I've lost focus, and it's had an impact on the company. But I want you all to know, I'm back. Fully." He scanned the charts and reports laid out in front of him, absorbing every detail with the sharpness that had once been his trademark. In a swift and concise presentation, Ethan outlined strategies to rebuild investor confidence, fast-track delayed projects, and improve internal communication. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Lucas was the first to speak. "That's the Ethan Hayes we've been waiting for." The team's confidence seemed to be returning, but Ethan knew it wasn't just the company that needed fixing. There was something deeper, something he couldn't ignore any longer. While Ethan worked tirelessly to stabilize his business, Emily was gathering the courage to see him again. After days of hesitation, she decided it was time to confront her fears. She took her sketchbook, the one with the drawing of him, made without realizing how much he meant to her, and headed to the cafe, where Sam greeted her with his usual warm smile. "Sam, has he been here?" she asked directly. Sam shook his head, but there was a hopeful glint in his eyes. "No, but he'll turn up. Give him time." Emily sighed and took a seat at her usual table. She opened the sketchbook and stared at Ethan's face on the page. "Why does this have to be so complicated?" she muttered. Sam, who had been listening from behind the counter, walked over with a cup of tea. "Because the best things usually are. But, Emily, if you don't take the risk, you'll never know what could have been." His words lingered in her mind. For the first time, Emily realized it wasn't just Ethan who had something to prove. She, too, needed to face her own fears. That evening, as Ethan closed the final reports in his penthouse, his gaze fell on something unexpected, the notebook where he'd written about Emily. He picked it up, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The words he'd poured onto the pages weeks ago were still there, raw, honest, real. I need to sort this out, he said to himself. At the same time, Emily was back at the cafe, deciding she couldn't wait any longer. She handed the sketchbook to Sam, asking him to give it to Ethan if he showed up. I need him to know, she said with a sad smile. The next morning, when Ethan walked into the cafe, Sam handed him the sketchbook without a word. Ethan opened it on the spot, his heart racing as he saw the drawing of himself, captured with a precision and care that moved him deeply. On the opposite page, there was a note from Emily. Ethan, you said you saw me. Now I see you. I'm sorry I ran. I'll be at the park, in our spot, if you still want to see me. Ethan didn't waste a second. He left the cafe and headed straight for the park, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, he spotted Emily sitting on the bench, the sketchbook resting on her lap. Emily, he called, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up, and for a moment, neither of them said a word. Then, Emily smiled, that shy smile Ethan had grown to love. You came, she whispered. I never left, he replied, sitting down beside her. Their reunion at the park marked the beginning of something both of them knew would be different. As they sat side by side, Ethan gently took Emily's hands in his, feeling the roughness of her skin, a testament to her struggles and resilience. Emily, he said, his voice steady but kind, I can't promise it'll be easy. But what I feel for you is real, and I want to see where this can go. She held his gaze, seeing the sincerity that had once scared her but now felt almost comforting. I want to try too, she replied with a small smile. But I need to take things slowly. I'm still learning to trust. Slow's fine, Ethan said softly, squeezing her hands. In the months that followed, Ethan and Emily began to build a new life together. Ethan helped her find a small flat, something she'd been reluctant to accept at first, but he insisted it was just a starting point for her independence. Emily, in turn, threw herself into her art, producing more work than ever before and securing a new exhibition through Clara. At work, Ethan regained his position of leadership with renewed focus, but his perspective had shifted. He started to find a balance between the corporate world and the simple things Emily had taught him to appreciate. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park, Emily paused to watch a street artist painting in the open air. She stood mesmerized, while Ethan waited patiently beside her. Do you still think we're from different worlds? He asked suddenly. Emily smiled, shaking her head. I think our worlds were different, but now we're building a new one. Ethan pulled her closer, wrapping her in an embrace that needed no words. From that moment on, Ethan and Emily continued to build their story together, facing challenges and celebrating victories. They learned that the differences between their worlds weren't barriers, but bridges to something greater, a connection that transcended status, circumstance, or fear. And, finally, they found what they had both been searching for, a home, in each other. This was the story of Ethan and Emily, two people from such different worlds who, despite everything, found a way to connect and create something unique. Life teaches us that love isn't about what we own or where we come from, but about having the courage to see beyond appearances and overcome our own fears. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Do you believe love can overcome any difference? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Oh, and before you go, click on the video that's about to pop up on your screen for another heartfelt tale that's sure to move you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.